I'm looking forward to getting into that and completing one chapter of the story of God's chosen people, the Israelites, as we move out of Joshua and look forward to getting into Judges, the next phase. And this is sort of, in a sense, this is one to savor because things have gone comparatively quite well throughout the course of the book of Joshua. And we're about to take a nosedive, so we're going to enjoy this while we can. But before we get into the material, Brian's going to lead us in prayer.
Holy and merciful Father, who art in heaven, we're so thankful to be able to come here this evening, take time out to study your word. We pray, Father, that our ears will be attentive to the things that will be said, that we will think upon them and contemplate their meaning, and pray, Father, that we'll be able to gain the understanding that we need to apply those principles to our own lives in this day and age. We pray, Father, that you be with those who are not with us, especially those who are going to be dealing with illness. And we pray that you would comfort them, be able to touch them with your healing hand, to restore their health to them, that they can be out at the next point in time. We're thankful so much for your Son, Jesus, who came and paid the ultimate price for our sins. We pray, Father, that we will reflect upon his life and what he did as he lived among men to set the example for us. Pray, Father, that we will live in such a way that your Son might be reflected upon right in our lives, that others might see us and ask us why we live the way we do. Pray, Father, that you give us an opportunity to be able to explain to them your word and the blessings that are found within it. Pray that you be with each and every one of us and help us to keep our minds open to the things that will be said. In the same way, we pray in your Son, Jesus.
All right, who wants to get us started with the memory verse? Nancy?
And the people said to Joshua, "No, we will serve the Lord." And that's Joshua 24:21.
4:21. Very good. And can somebody give us a recap of what we discussed on Sunday? Brian?
If memory serves me correctly, they had just completed dividing the land, and they sent the 2.5 tribes back across to the east side of Jordan. And as they went across, they decided to resurrect an altar. And in doing so, word got back to the west side of Israel. And they made some assumptions that they were going to use that to make sacrifices and offerings to another god, per se, who knows. So they decided that they were going to gather the tribes and go to war, but then they decided to send the chief rulers to the other side and talk to them first. And then once they found out that the altar was actually built as a witness, not only to them, but to the other side, that they are part of, this tribe of Israel, and they are not to be forgotten what they did as far as helping out with taking the land.
Okay, so we have this this kind of bittersweet parting, and then this colossal misunderstanding where a great majority of the nation are ready to fly off the handle And fortunately, at least they, as Brian said, thought, maybe we should talk to him first. And we had a lot that we could learn from it in our own interactions today. That gets us into chapter 23, and I think we would be right around Stacy. Stacy, if you want to read for us Joshua chapter 23, the first 5 verses, please.
Now it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in age. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has fought for you. See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off as far as the great sea westward. And the Lord your God will expel them from before you, and drive them out of your sight. So you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you.
Thank you. How much time had passed then between the last chapter and this one? Sorry?
Many days.
Many days, yeah. It's been some time. Now we can guesstimate. Of course, it's only a guesstimate, but it's a fairly reasonable guesstimate. If we were to assume that Joshua is somewhere in the neighborhood of Caleb's age, which seems pretty reasonable, then we know that Joshua died, we find at the end of chapter 24, at 110 years old. So the fact that Caleb was 85 as they finished up the conquest, that gives us, some kind of an idea that in the ballpark of 25 years plus or minus, 10, 15, something like that. We at least have some kind of idea that it's been some years, quite a while. And what has been going on in between? We had this whole thing with the eastern tribes, and then, a long time afterward. Well, what's everybody been doing in the interim?
And they had rest from war. So maybe planting and growing and settling in.
Living in the land that God has given them. They're just going about life, aren't they? Okay, so things are going pretty well. They've completed this conquest. They've been given rest. They've been given this peace on all sides from all of their enemies. And they're getting about the business of enjoying the inheritance that God had promised for so long and has now given to them. So Joshua calls a meeting. Why?
Because he's getting old.
Okay, and therefore?
And therefore, somebody needs to take his spot.
Something like that, yeah. So he doesn't directly say that, and he doesn't in the way that Moses had. Granted, Moses had God's specific direction to do this, but he doesn't appoint a direct successor to say, as Moses appointed me, I'm going to appoint, him. He just doesn't do that. And whether that's because it didn't occur to him, I kind of doubt it, or because he didn't want to presume to sort of anoint his successor when God hadn't told him any such thing. We don't know for certain, but I think it's the latter of those two. Mallory?
I kind of did it. It was weird. When I got ready to go to college, and my parents would come in and be like, these are your last days here. Like, I didn't die, right? And they didn't die. But it was like, these are your last days. I'm going to reinstill, remember all the things you've been doing. Because for, your senior year, at least for me, there was more like, this is your safety net to practice being a grown-up. Now you're legit, just continue doing these things. And so that's kind of how I viewed it. Like, I'm leaving you, but keep doing the things you're doing, even if I'm not.
Exactly right. So he's doing kind of a farewell address. And so he's called together the elders, these men who are themselves in positions of authority and who are respected, and reminding them, it's not just like your parents weren't telling you things. They didn't wait until you were headed off to college and say, all right, Mallory, there's some things that we've been holding out on you, and we really want to make sure you understand them before you leave in a week. Of course they're not doing that. They're reaffirming the things that they've taught you your entire life up to this point, but they're giving you a reminder and hoping that it's going to stick in your memory because of the massive change that's about to take place in your life or in the Israelites' life. So that's what Joshua is doing as well. He's preparing them. He's trying to provide for the next generation to have some kind of direction. All right, let's keep reading. Jacob, can you read for us Joshua 23, verses 6 through 13, please?
Sorry, what was yours again?
Joshua 23, 6 through 13.
Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done this day. The Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to fight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you.
Thank you. Question number 1, finally. What was to keep the Israelites from turning aside to the right or the left? Nancy?
The law of Moses.
If they will keep and do the commandments that God has given in the law, then that's going to take care of all of those problems. And what was Joshua particularly concerned that they should avoid? Nancy?
The other nations, those that were to intermarry, that not even think about it.
Okay, so yeah, the intermarriage, the mingling with the peoples of the land, and of course the influx of idolatry that would take place as a result thereof. Number 2, how would one Israelite put to flight 1,000 enemies?
With the Lord's help.
Sorry?
With the Lord's help.
Yeah, God's the one fighting for them. It's not actually they who are the ones who have to fight the battles. Of course, their involvement is necessary. They do need to put themselves on the line to demonstrate their trust in Him. They have to obey Him, but it's not up to them to actually accomplish the victories. Number 3, what would be the consequences of intermarrying? We sort of answered this, but what would be the consequences of intermarrying with the Canaanites? Yeah?
The Lord will no longer drive out their enemies.
Okay, because there's sort of a step that's halfway in between, kind of. What's that?
A snare and a trap.
Say again?
They would be a snare and a trap to them.
In what way?
Because they would turn them away from God.
Okay,
They
they're
can
going to
notice
be a
that.
source of temptation. They're going to be an enticement, a draw away from God. And now, to be clear, God has commanded them, don't intermarry with these people. That's enough. Even if this other problem weren't involved, that would be enough. If they disregarded that commandment, then God has every right to say, okay, well, I'm not driving these people out. But He's generous enough to tell them what the reason is, that if you intermarry with him, this is what's going to happen. And then I'm going to stop helping. Mallory?
Did someone marry, didn't somebody have to intermarry with Rahab?
Yes. My next question, Mallory has just introduced. Is God against interracial marriage?
Not really.
Nancy?
Not really. He's looking at who they're looking to. And if Rahab looked towards God because she understood He was guiding them to defeat all the people But he knows none of these other people are, because they didn't make any step forward with that.
Okay, they didn't act on it in the way that Rahab did. That's a very important detail. Mark?
Well, I mean, the Jewish people were a peculiar entity to God because Jesus was going to come through them, and he wanted that lineage to be a pure lineage.
Ish. Remember, Rahab is in that
I
lineage.
understand that.
So is
I'm
Ruth.
just
Don't get me
saying.
wrong.
But if that were true, I mean, if God was, didn't want people intermixing, then we'd have a problem. Because if I'm not mistaken, didn't Moses marry an Ethiopian woman?
Yeah, well, it mentions that he had married a Cushite or an Ethiopian woman in Numbers 11-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood. Yeah, so Moses had married with a Gentile woman, which is one of my examples here. Of course, Rahab is a Gentile, a Canaanite, lives in Jericho and marries into the Israelites. Ruth is a Moabite. She marries into that same lineage, marries a descendant of Rahab, as a matter of fact. And of course, as I mentioned, Jesus comes through that. There's another example later on. Remember Uriah and Bathsheba. He's called Uriah the Hittite, as if that's his last name, because he's not an Israelite, and yet he has married into this nation as well. Mallory?
I think, at least especially in the Old Testament, he was more against inter-spiritual relationships as opposed to interrelational.
Basically.
If we could phrase it that way.
Yes. So there's another thing to mention. So along the lines that what Mark was getting at, remember when the Israelites were in Exodus chapter, is it 12? I think it's in chapter 12 or later in chapter 13, wherever it is, where they start the Exodus, where they begin to walk out of Egypt. And it mentions the number of them, and it says there are about 600,000 men on foot, etc., etc. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and a bunch of livestock. It doesn't. Mixed multitude, what's up with that? What's in the mixed multitude, Nancy?
Well, that could be even some of the Egyptians.
That's what it sounds like. You've got a mixed multitude, as if you've got Egyptians, you've got other peoples who were perhaps enslaved to the Egyptians or other residents of that area, and they're looking at the options here, and they're going, okay, I'm going with them. I don't really want to be a part of all this. I'm going to associate with these people. You've got the example that just shortly thereafter that Mark brought up of Moses bringing in, we don't know exactly what the timeline is, but it's mentioned shortly after that, I suppose. Bringing in a Cushite or Ethiopian woman and marrying her. So it's all kind of confusing, but what we've got here is many of the commandments that God gives, and for instance in the Passover command associated with that same night, when he says the servant who is in your household can partake of this feast once he's been circumcised. The idea is he doesn't have to be of your bloodline. He's a Gentile. But if you have made him a part of your people, if you have made him a part of the covenant with God, he's been circumcised. Same with the sojourner who wants to dwell with the Israelites. He doesn't get to partake of the Passover unless he is circumcised and keeps the law, unless he becomes a Jew. That's what he's talking about. So people want to forsake all of that stuff, as Ruth did. Ruth is the great example of this. She says to Naomi, her mother-in-law, where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. If they're willing to do that, great. No problem there.
I was going to say, well, inside the temple, there were certain areas reserved only for Gentiles and non-Jews.
That's right.
If you were not a Jew and you got in the wrong place, you were in trouble.
Very much so. And there are some laws in Deuteronomy that we didn't read specifically, but that pertain to like the Edomites. So Edomites are sort of cousins to the Israelites, and they were allowed to intermarry to an extent with the Edomites. They are not on this list of nations that they were not to intermarry with specifically. But of course, the Edomites weren't allowed to come near to the sanctuary. They weren't allowed in the courtyard. And there's I forget exactly what the number is, but there's a stipulation, like to the third or fourth generation, something like that. But after that, then yes, it's as if, to look at it from a purely genetic standpoint, you could be saying, sort of, that, well, yeah, but now their genes have been diluted enough that it's all Israelite. But that's not really the point. It's just about the fact that it is very obvious that this person and his offspring are now Israelites and not of this other nation. So he's drawing a distinction between his people and everybody else. And his people, even from this time, he started with a racial group. But that wasn't the extent of it, even from the beginning. Now,
I was going to say, it sounds like because he had those provisions about how sojourners or other people could be like grafted into the group. It was never supposed to be this pure genealogical thing, but you can see as time went on, that's what they held on to.
Yeah, for sure.
And became very much a racial genealogical type of thing, which is why, you know, he had to destroy all of the records to be like, enough, this is ridiculous. But that's why I think like it's definitely more of that spiritual, interspiritual thing. He's like, he's a jealous God, doesn't want to compete with other gods. Do not bring your other gods here. Bring whatever races and stuff you have, fine, but do not bring your gods here.
Exactly right. You can come and be an Israelite. You can come and worship the Lord. The trouble is if one of the Israelites is going the other way. You can't go and be one of them. It doesn't work that way. Now, we've seen some kind of overlap and some hints in here of something that might apply to us. How does this apply to us then? There'll be a couple directions we go with this. Mark?
Well, I'll go down this direction. Probably one of the, of course, God said it over and over, one of the biggest risks of being involved with outside outside Judaism, with not being a Jew, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is the introduction of idolatry, and these things eventually happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the track, and I guess the modern day for us is to be careful of the associations we have, because they could have the same type of effect on us.
Exactly right.
Away from God.
You are going to be influenced by the people around you. You can also have an influence on the people around you. Now, we're not supposed to wall ourselves off. We're not supposed to get rid of everybody else and say we're going to be, the pure people of God, and nobody is allowed to come near, and we're going to just sort of cloister ourselves off from the rest of the world. No, we're supposed to be a light to the world. But it needs to go in that direction. We need to be an influence and not be influenced by the world. Jen?
A verse that comes to mind is, don't be unevenly yoked.
Unequally yoked, yeah, with unbelievers, exactly. Yeah, that's the same principle that Paul is getting at in that passage. Okay.
Jeremy?
Sorry,
I think
go ahead.
the other thing is you have to be careful when you look at, like I call it like my Christian heritage because I have several generations, but when you start getting into these multiple generations, so you can track back, you often miss the influence that the Rahabs and the roots in your congregation can bring too.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to look down on somebody who is that first generation, because you look at what Rahab did and what Ruth did and what that influence did for that generation. And so we have to be careful as we're raising our children to make sure that we're teaching them to love God, but to also love people and remember that like everyone's an opportunity to actually either reignite, lost zeal we could have for doing the same thing that I've been doing for 34 years, right? So like we have to, as Christians, yes, there's that influence of being isolated as this is my heritage.
Absolutely. It's a good way to think about it is this is a big family. The church is described that way over and over in the Bible. Everybody is a candidate for adoption into the family. We think about it that way, and we think about the first generation Christian who's just become recently a part of the family. Well, just like we wouldn't think it's right to love your biological offspring, but not love your adopted kids. It's not right to treat them differently in this instance either. Okay, let's keep reading. I recognize you, but I don't remember a name. Do you want to read?
Sure.
Okay, can you take for us Joshua 23, verses 14 through 16?
Joshua 23.
14 through 16, please.
And behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and ye know in all your hearts and in your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which Jehovah your God speaks concerning you. All are come to pass unto you. Not one thing hath failed thereof. And if it shall come to pass, that as all the good things are come upon you of which Jehovah your God speaks unto you, So will Jehovah bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land which Jehovah your God has given you. When ye transgress and the covenant of Jehovah your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods, and bow down yourselves to them, then will the anger of Jehovah be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he has given you.
Thank you. Question number 4. How many of the good words which the Lord spoke concerning the Israelites failed? Nancy?
Not one failed. It
Not a
was
single
all
one.
fulfilled. Yeah,
So how many of the threats would fail if they rejected him?
not one.
Same answer. Lesson for us in that? Mallory says no. Mark?
Well, you know, the New Testament, we read the soul that sins, that will die. And if we are wise, we will see that when God says something, he does it. And there's not going to be, you know, the longer I live, the more I'm convinced that people actually think that somehow, some way, that they're going to be able to do whatever they want to do in life and still somehow make it in. And if they understood the God of the Bible, the Old Testament, God is a God of love. There's no question about that. But there's severity as well. And if we're wise, we'll do what God tells us to do.
Exactly. The threats apply to us too. And if we focus on, we tend to focus on the things that we like, you know, and it's fine to use those as positive incentives to say, oh, well, this is the reward that is laid up for you if you follow him, if you trust in him, if you obey him. And then let's not talk about the nasty things. Let's not talk about the threats. We think of that as being kind of a gauche, and think of it as just being like, oh, it's unsavory. Don't even think about that. We're just going to focus on trying to entice. That's not the whole picture. God's not interested in, you know, coaxing a handful of people. He's threatening everybody. His judgment's going to come one day, and you can either be with me or you can be against me. It's your choice. Now, make your bed. Now,
I think the trick that like the Israelites came into and that we can fall into is that the threats are for them, us, outside of this.
Yeah.
Because I have now become in the family, and even though we wouldn't, you know, say that we are always saved, a lot of times we do treat it like the threats actually apply more to others. I might sin, but the bad threats, those are for those who aren't even part of Christ. And I think that, you know, the Israelites also fell into that. They were shocked when these things happened, because like the threat was to you, even if you were blind enough to like not think it was toward you.
that's kind of what Mark was getting at. I'll put it into my own words as well. It's different when we do it. Of course it's not, and yet that's the way most people tend to think. And it's so easy for us to look at other people's failings and then completely blind ourselves to our own. But we need to first look at ourselves before we can even think about looking outward. And the Israelites did not have a great history of doing that, but at least throughout the course of Joshua, they did a fairly good job. Okay. Let's keep reading. Andrew, can you take for us chapter 24, verses 1 through 5?
Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, called for the elders of Israel, for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants and gave him to Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave the mountains of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Also I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt according to what I did among them. Afterward I brought you out.
Thank you. Number 5, where did Joshua gather all the tribes of Israel together?
The second.
Shechem. Excuse me. What had happened there earlier in the course of this book that's kind of important? Go ahead, Nancy.
That's where they were at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and they had the blessings and the cursings.
That's right. So Shechem sits right in between the two. And what had Joshua set up? Do you remember? Anyone? What is it?
Was it the altar with the 12 stones?
Yeah.
From each of the tribes when they came over, right?
Yeah.
Or am I thinking of something different?
Well, it's yes, but you're also more or less right. So you're conflating a little bit of the memorial when they crossed the Jordan, but it's basically the same thing that he erects, that he sets up at Shechem as well. And he also writes a copy of the law on. It's not completely clear whether it's those stones or another stone. I think it sounds like it's the same stones, but regardless. So he has the law written out, and he reads the law to the Israelites, and then he has, as Nancy said, he reads off the blessings and the curses to the people who are assembled on the mountains. So he now calls the people of Israel together, especially, the elders, the heads, the judges, the officers, it says in verse 1, to the same place where they had all gathered a few decades prior, and probably remember some of this stuff, even if some of them were not all that old at the time. And there's a lot of sort of gravitas associated with that location, and especially with Joshua now being a very old man, and he's giving one last address to the people. Okay, we just answered that one. Okay. What sort of people had their forefathers been before God called Abraham?
Polytheistic.
What?
They were polytheistic. They were just like everybody.
Polytheistic, yeah, they were idolaters, weren't they? So just like the people that they have driven out of the land that God has given, well, they came from that same heritage, didn't they? Which is an important thing for them to remember, that, we're not really all that different fundamentally. It's that God has been a part of our lineage in a way that he hasn't been a part of their lineage, because he selected Abraham, because he blessed Abraham, he blessed Isaac, he blessed Jacob, and so on and so forth. Number 6, to whom did God give Mount Seir?
Esau.
To Esau, to the nation of Edom, his descendants, and so that remained in the hands of the Edomites for, basically until the Edomites ceased to be a nation. Let's keep reading. Okay, let's break it. The next chunk is kind of long, so I'll break it up between Kevin and Sammy. Kevin, can you take verses 6 through 8, and then Sammy take verses 9 through 13, please?
But when your ancestors arrived at the Red Sea, the Egyptians chased after you with chariots and charioteers. When your ancestors cried out to the Lord, I put darkness between you and the Egyptians. I brought the sea crashing down on the Egyptians, drowning them. With your very own eyes, you saw what I did. Then you lived in the wilderness for many years. Finally, I brought you into the land of the Amorites, on the east side of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I destroyed them before you. I gave you victory over them, and you took possession of their land.
Then Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, started a war against Israel. He summoned Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you, but I would not listen to him. Instead, I made Balaam bless you, and so I rescued you from Balak. When you crossed the Jordan River and came to Jericho, the men of Jericho fought against you, as did the Amorites. The Perizzites and Canaanites, the Hittites, the Gerishites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, but I gave you victory over them. And I sent terror ahead of you to drive out the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not your sword or bows that brought you victory. I gave you land you had not worked on. I gave you towns you did not build, the towns where you are living now. I gave you vineyards and olive groves for food, though you did not plant them.
Thank you. Number 7, who is the father of Balak?
Zippor.
King of Moab.
Yeah, seems like kind of an odd little tidbit to pull out of there, but nevertheless. How many nations had tried to hinder Israel from receiving their inheritance?
7? Is it 7?
There are a canonical 7 that are mentioned who live in the land, but he adds a couple more on this list. Just count them up, guys. Somewhere.
8.
We're looking at something like 9. I count the Egyptians first of all, and then the Amorites, the Moabites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. That's a lot. That's a lot of different groups of people, isn't it? So you've got this one nation, the Israelites, and then you've got all of these other nations. And granted, some of them, like the Moabites, are related to them back, from Abraham and then the next generation beneath that and everything. But that's a lot of different nations that have tried to get in the way. A lot of different nations with their own boundaries, with their own culture, with their own gods, their own system of religion and worship. And the next one is always crazier than the last. And they've all tried to band together. And that's why Joshua is bringing this up. That so many different powerful groups have stood in their way, and yet God brought them through it all. Okay, and what was the result? What did they get out of this in the end?
They got the land that God's promised them.
Exactly what God promised. They ended up with farms and vineyards and orchards that they did not plant, cities that they did not build, living in houses that they did not build. God gave them a huge wealth of inheritance. Okay. Now I want to read verses 14 through 28, all as one chunk, because it's kind of the climax of Joshua's speech here. So I'll just read that. Verse 14. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people answered, Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. But Joshua said to the people, You are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, No, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. He said, Then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was in the sanctuary, by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. So Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. Okay, so what was the commitment the people made? Fletcher?
Follow God.
We're going to follow God. We're going to shun all these idols. We don't care what these nations have done. We don't care how they behave. We don't care about their idol. We don't care how they worship. We don't care that they're going to influence us. We're going to forget that and serve the Lord. And if you say you're going to you're going to set up this stone as a witness against us, sounds great. Put that stone there. We want this. to have a physical representation, a symbol for us to remember this by later. This is a very strong, firm commitment that they are making. All right, let's finish out the book. We've got a few minutes left. Mallory, can you read verses 29 through 33?
It came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, on the north of Mount Gaash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel had brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the piece of the ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Emor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. And Eleazar the son of Aaron died, and they buried him in Judah, and Phinehas his son, which was given him in the hill of country of Ephraim.
Thank you. Number 8. How old was Joshua when he died? 10. We mentioned that earlier. And by the way, this reminds me, the question came up last week about whether Phinehas was the high priest, and I was going, I'm not sure that we know whether Eleazar is still alive at this point. And it's mentioned here, it doesn't actually say when it took place that Eleazar died, but it certainly sounds as if it took place after or round about the death of Joshua and the reinterment of the bones of Joseph. Okay, so with that out of the way, by the way, it's worth noting that it was an ancient commitment that had been made to take the bones of Joseph up out of Egypt and to bury them in his inheritance. The place that he left when he was, he was 17. He went back briefly to bury his father for a period of days, and that was it. But the rest of his life, a long, long life, he lived in Egypt. And yet he wanted his bones to be buried in the land that God had promised to his forefathers, including down to him. Okay, number 9, where were Joshua and Eleazar buried? Nancy?
Well, Joshua was buried at Timnath-Serah, and Eleazar was at Gibeah.
Okay, and why would they be buried there? Why would it matter in any way, shape, or form?
It was their inheritance.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I mean, not really. It's just a body. Doesn't matter what happens to it. But there is some appropriateness in those who remain after their deaths, showing them that honor and the fact of burying their bodies on the land of their inheritance. It reaffirms that, that it is an inheritance. It's something that's supposed to be passed down from father to son to grandson and so on and so forth. And that's what God had intended for them. Okay. How effective was Joshua's whole contrived assembly and the argument where he's saying, no, you're not able to serve the Lord? Well, of course he wants them to make that commitment, and yet he's sort of pretending to dissuade them from doing that and getting them to argue against him. How effective was all of that? Your hand out there?
Sure. It was good until all the old people died.
Yeah, so, I mean, it could have been better. But all things considered, pretty good. You know? What we're going to see, you turn the page and things, like I said at the beginning, are going to take a sharp downturn. And it's not going to outlive the leader, really, after that. You'll get this judge, and the judge will come in, and the people will say, yes, let's serve the Lord, and that's fine. Oh, he's dead? So about that Baal statue, I'm going back over, it takes no time at all for them to start rejecting God as soon as the judge is gone. In some cases, it seems like the judge is not even quite dead yet before they start going after the idols. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, it says that they did really good, after Joshua and the elders.
That's right.
And then after all the initial leaders, all of them are gone, then they just...
Yeah, so what we see is those who witnessed, in this case, did a great job of managing themselves and the next generation. They didn't do a very good job, apparently, of instilling upon that next generation that they needed to do the same thing for the subsequent generations. That is an important lesson for us to learn as well. We need to, first of all, learn the lesson from Joshua. Use whatever means necessary, even sort of this goofy argument thing that Joshua is doing. It's obviously effective. Use it. Use that. Get people to make commitments. Use the dying old man card. Play that card. It's fine. If you can get somebody to make a good commitment to God that way, if it sticks out in their memory because of that, all the better. That's fine. Use what's available to you. Also, teach them to do the same. Teach the next generation. Teach your kids to pass it on to the next generation after that. And that's where we have to leave it. We'll be on lesson 189 on Sunday. Thank you.
Hello, people.
You got the rock with all the law?
You have to
Yes, because it has all the
You mean the maple tree?
Doing well. Ready for drive.
You know what I
So
mean?
really good Friday, Saturday morning.
Good evening. To start our songs, our first song will be 176, He's My King. If you want to mark the song of invitation, it'll be 8:12, and we'll be having Dan do the invitation tonight. So 176, He's My King. All day long of Jesus I am singing, He's my song, of joy will ever be. All the while He keeps my heart bells ringing, for His love is everything to me. He's my precious King, and though I dearly love Him, He's my Lord, my King, no other is above Him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing and sing. He's my blessed Savior, He's my King, my blessed King.
flowing from his heart, love's everlasting spring. That is why my faith in him I'm showing. That is why that endless song I sing. He's my precious King, and oh, I dearly love him. He's my Lord, my King, no other is above him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing, I sing. He's my blessed my Savior, he's my King, my blessed King. In his life, I'm going home to glory with the souls who trust his saving grace. Going home to sing and tell his story in the blessed sunshine of his face. He's my precious King, and oh, I dearly love him. He's my Lord, my King, no other is above him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing, I sing. He's my blessed Savior, he's my King, my blessed King.
Good evening. It's good to have a good number here on a Wednesday night. I was subbing in for the 4 and 5-year-olds class tonight. I think I used as many words in that classroom in the 45 minutes as I did the entire rest of the day probably, but I've got a few left in me for the announcement or the invitation tonight. Go ahead and turn to the book of James. I have a few verses that we'll use there as a springboard. Book of James. While you are turning there, I have a very brief thought exercise to lead you all on for just a moment. Use with me your imaginations for a short while. We are all sitting in the audience of a courtroom. The defendant and his lawyer are seated ahead of us. Front of the room contains that traditional, very large, very prestigious desk for the judge. The person sitting there, a little unorthodox. Tank top, flip-flops, messy hair. And the person who is sitting in the judge's seat doesn't just look odd, he is acting odd. We haven't gone through anything in the trial yet. This guy leans over that lectern, guilty. He has already decided the defendant is guilty, and he is laying into this guy. And nobody who's in the courtroom knows quite what to do. We all know this is not the way it's supposed to go. There's somebody in the judge's seat, and he is acting like he's the judge, but clearly he's not, right? Not the way he looks, not the way he acts. Nothing is going according to what we all know it should be. Somebody walks in from the back of the room. Who is this? And this person who walks in has a dark robe. This person has dress shoes that click as he walks on the floor. His hair is neat. That, clearly, that's the judge. Two things change, right, when that judge comes in. Number one, the judge orders the bailiff to remove that imposter from his seat so the actual trial can begin. And number two, everything that tank top wearing guy who was in the judge's seat, we can all immediately discard it, right? Because we know that even though he passed a judgment, doesn't count. He was not the correct person. He did not have the authority to do that. The thoughts this evening are inspired by James 5:9. We'll read that in a few verses out of James 5 in just a moment. But while we're in this frame of mind still, right, sometimes identifying that fraudulent judge is easy, right? Like in my example, he didn't look the part, he didn't act the part, and so very clearly we knew when he was in that position, he didn't have the authority to be there. And then also, when the actual judge comes in, that made it even more obvious, right? Nobody was fooled by that guy wearing a tank top, wearing flip-flops, had messy hair, who was in the judge's seat but was not acting or looking or conducting himself in any way like the judge. There's other easy examples out there, right? Like I see it in my house. I'm sure you either see it in your own kids or when you had kids at home, right? You probably saw this same thing where sometimes your kids assume the role of the parent and they start trying to discipline their siblings, right? They don't have the authority to do that, but we see it happening. So again, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes I think it can be easy where we realize we are in that position. We have made ourselves that fraudulent judge, deciding who should or shouldn't be a member of a local church based on silly stuff, right? They look a bit different, their background's a bit different. I know some of their shortcomings in the past, right? Whatever. Right? The point, we can find ourselves in that position knowing with 20/20 hindsight that we shouldn't be. With that, let's take a look at James here. Again, James 5, I'll pick up the reading in verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Judge is right at the door, right? If you knew, if we go back to that initial scenario I created, right? If you know the judge is right at the door, you're not going to act the way that imposter did, right? For us here in the context of this invitation tonight, right? If the judge is at the door, right, there are some obvious takeaways, right? Number one, don't commit sin because you know the judge is out there. But also, especially don't commit sin when the judge is right there watching, right? There's going to be no uncertainty about what was going on. James 5 is a little bit paradoxical, right? Verse 7, which we read, right? Be patient until the coming of the Lord, implying that it could take a while, right? They use the example of the farmer who has to wait for the fullness of the season before he attempts any harvest, right? It could take us a while. Verse 8, again, be patient, but then they end that verse saying, but the Lord is near. How am I supposed to do those two things, right? And why? Why should I be patient if the Lord is right there, if the Lord is near, right? Answer, because once the Lord returns, that's it, right? Jig is up. There's no more chances. There's no do-overs. We'll find out in that moment, if we aren't already convinced of it, that he has all the authority, right? That we don't have it. And so one of the takeaways is we need to respect the boundaries that we were given. A few other verses quickly, just to kind of support this idea. Hebrews 9:27, and inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment, right? Again, that sense of finality, right? That when that comes, that is the final moment, and all the chips are on the table. We find out where we stand. John 16:18. When he comes, he will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness and judgment. Final verse, back in the direction we had just come from, 2 Peter 3:10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed in an intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. All these verses, right, pushing this idea of finality, but also suddenness. The judge is near, but he hasn't called for judgment quite yet. One more verse to build off of this scenario. Go back to 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, 3rd verse. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So imagine our initial scenario again, right? There's an obvious imposter in the judge's seat. What would happen if instead everybody accepted this man, right? They accept the imposter. They accept the charlatan. They accept his judgment. They decide that he is, for whatever reason, better than the actual judge. What happens when the actual judge comes back to the courtroom? The imposter is not the only person that is going to get thrown out of that courtroom, right? The imposter is not the only person who is going to find himself on the wrong end of judgment in that moment. The judge still has authority, whether we recognize it or not. The imposter is still going to be dealt with, and so are those people who choose to align with him. So we understand then that the judgment is final, and if, like those verses said, the Lord is near, is proximate, what do, right? We need to prepare. We need to prepare ourselves. We need to prepare those around us. One final verse back in James again. James 5, take a look, still in the 5th chapter, verse 19, last one in the chapter there. My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, verse 20, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Mistakes and shortcomings, wrongdoings, whatever it may be, they're not final, not yet, right? These things are all recoverable. These things are all things that can be corrected, that can be turned away from, as the verse calls out there. And that is of benefit for the person who makes correction. That is of benefit for the person who helps guide him in that direction. That is ultimately pleasing to the Lord. Now, the way that verse is written, right, makes it pretty obvious, right? He's talking to brethren about those who strayed, and now he's trying to push them back, right? This is very clearly written for Christians. So there's something in this for all of us tonight, right? Those who that might find themselves in that condition, they need to be mindful of repentance, right? They need to make that correction. Others, though, might be in need of baptism. They don't find themselves in that condition yet, right? The challenge is the same for all of us. We all need to be living up to that standard. We all need to be considering our own ways. And we have an opportunity to consider these things tonight. Is there something we need to make correction of? Are we on the wrong side of the judge? Have we perhaps been judging others when we ourselves would then find us guilty? So we have some things, all to just challenging thoughts for us tonight. I would encourage you, dwell on these things. If you have any needs, please, please, please make them known as we all stand and as we sing.
All things are ready. Come to the feast. Come, for the table now is spread. Ye perishing, ye weary come, and thou shalt be richly fed. Hear the invitation, whosoever will come. Hear the invitation, whosoever see a good number out this evening. I want to thank Dan for the invitation and all the teachers, of course, who taught tonight as well. Let's be thinking about those that aren't here tonight. I think Dave's got a surgery coming up.
Right, he has a pre-op appointment tomorrow to make sure everything's good for next week to have that surgery. And then also, there's still an opening for this Sunday to pick him up as well, so
Okay.
Sunday's not covered.
All right. So, right for Dave as well. I guess Devin, same old thing. Can keep continuing treatments. Mark.
Ellen and I will be traveling up to her mother's all next week.
Okay, so Mark and Ellen going out of town. See Jacob. Anything else? Anybody else got anything? If not, we'll have our closing Fletcher.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for the opportunity again to come together to worship you, to learn about you. I pray that we are always ready, always prepared for your judgment. We don't know when it'll be, but maybe not take for granted the opportunity that we have. Please watch over the Caissons as they travel, and the Smiths as they make the move to Ohio. Continue to watch over Dave and Devin and Sandy's husband, and please watch over us throughout this week. May we put into practice what we learned tonight. In Christ's name I pray, amen.